So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and kind
Do I
of...
talk to you the whole time?
Yeah.
I don't. Okay. I'm Karen Kwiatkowski, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, and I spent my last 4.5 years of 20 in the Pentagon, and my last almost a year working in the Office of Near East South Asia, and that's where Near East South Asia is like the Middle East policy, Office of Secretary of Defense policy for the Middle East region, and that's where I really, in that final year of my service, is where I was really exposed to some of the things that I've been speaking out about since I've retired.
Okay.
How much?
So let's start off here. Let's see. We're going to start off with all this stuff. Okay. So, at what point did you kind of realize that something was seriously wrong with what was happening in this environment?
I was moved into Near East South Asia from Sub-Saharan African Affairs in May of 2002, and the folks in the Middle East office had a shortage of manpower. They had lost some people earlier than they expected, and they had put out a call for volunteers amongst the policy staff. And I did not volunteer. No one volunteered to come work in the Middle East office. So finally, they mandated a few folks, and I was one that was basically directed to go over there. And prior to that, I worked in Sub-Saharan African Affairs, not an important area for George Bush. So when the George Bush administration came in, you could kind of call Sub-Saharan African Affairs defense policy a backwater. So I had no real concerns about anything going on until I was moved into the Near East South Asia office. And my very first day in the office, I sat there with my coworker, who was the Egypt desk, and she explained to me as we were talking about different things, and I was probably griping a little bit about, I can't believe I got sent over here and that kind of thing. And she was saying, well, and this was out of the blue in a sense. She said, if you have an opinion on the if you have a pro-Palestinian opinion on the Israel-Palestine issue, this is not the place to bring that up. You keep those opinions to yourself here in this office. And I thought that was strange because my assignment was, at that time when I first worked there, was Southern Arabian Gulf. I had Bahrain, Yemen, those countries. And, I just didn't think of those as being an issue, a place where I would be concerned about Israel and Palestine. It wasn't in our conversation. She brought that up out of the blue, and that was to help me understand the environment that I had just entered into. A very politicized environment, a very pro-Israel environment. There's really nothing wrong with that. I mean, Israel is a military ally of this country. But to be told about a certain political opinion that you should be either hold or otherwise be wary of, that was surprising. And so I would say the very first day I had a sense that some things weren't right. And as I look back, I think part of the reason that this person advised me in such a way is that she had already found this out the hard way. And so she's trying to help me. So yeah, that was the first day. Shortly thereafter, other things happened, and my eyes were opened. I asked coworkers to explain why things were being done in the way they were being done. I was very surprised that we were so far advanced in the planning for an Iraq war in May of 2002, when I had no sense that there was any planning for a war in Iraq prior to that. So I asked the folks, and pretty much the conclusion that, or the answer, the cumulative answer that I got was that the people that make the decisions here are all political appointees, and they're not just regular political appointees, but they're neoconservative political appointees. And there is no debating, and there is no argument. And your job as a staff officer is not to advise. They don't need to want your advice. Your job is to simply do what you're told, and that's what you'll do. And people who aren't in the military may say, well, of course, that's what the military person's job is, but it's not really true. In the Pentagon, when you're a staff officer, whether it's a professional civilian or a military officer, your job is to think. We have people at the mid-level and high-level field grade ranks, and their job is to think and to assess and to advise at a low level, but certainly to advise and to think. And I was being told in this office, no, that's not something that is needed. It's not necessary. The people doing the thinking they're not you. They are these other folks. They're political folks, and neoconservative in their viewpoint. You're not really needed to contribute to this. And it wasn't just me. It was all of us. I mean, these people advising me this were folks that had been there longer than me, who had either complained about it or come to terms with it. it's interesting that a number of those folks left the office, found ways to have their 3-year tour curtailed, moved on to a lateral position if they were a civilian, got a by name request if they were military into another office so that they could be pulled out. So I don't think that my reaction of concern was unique. It was not unique at all. Anyone who was seeing it with their eyes open around them knew that this is a place you did not want to be.
And when you looked at both the print and television news media during this time period, what are some of your reactions to what you were seeing from the inside and what you wish you would have been seeing?
Yeah, well, during the summer, of course, the big thing in the summer of 2002 were the famous leaks to the New York Times of PowerPoint slides from Central Command showing the advanced stages and proposals for this invasion of Iraq. And at that point, prior to those leaks, well, particularly the New York Times leak in July, there had been a previous leak that didn't have legs. It didn't have media legs. It didn't go anywhere, to the LA Times. William Arkin had done an article which said kind of the same thing, and it didn't go anywhere. So there was a second leak. I'm insinuating here that this leak was done purposely. My observation of it was certainly that it was done purposely to kind of generate a national discussion on the doability of an invasion of Iraq, and to kind of break the ice with the American people that this is where we're going to go next. As I watched this happen, and saw the advanced levels of planning for this war in Iraq, almost to the extent that it was a done deal, even as early as May or June of 2002. The sense of it was, yeah, we're going to do this. We just have to get everyone else on board. And the everyone else on board was the media and the American public, because they would have to be behind a war. They would need to have some sense of excitement about this war that had to be built up. And so it seemed like what I was seeing in the media was, as I look back now, was being shaped by the Pentagon. The Pentagon was actually pushing for war. Now, the Pentagon rarely pushes for war. If you remember the Powell doctrine, Weinberger-Powell doctrine, kind of the recuperation from the Vietnam syndrome, what we said was we would only, the American military would only go to war when there was a clear objective, when there was an exit strategy of some kind up front. And we would only go to war when we were able to mobilize with overwhelming strength against whatever that enemy was, based on the objective that we had. And this is the Powell-Weinberger doctrine. And it was kind of seen as the cure for the problem that Powell, as a young soldier, and others dealt with through Vietnam. So the Powell doctrine was totally not what these guys were going with. I mean, the clear objective, certainly that Saddam was evil, but everything else was kind of mushy, right? WMDs, what WMDs? They had to wait to they had to wait till September 2002 before the CIA could even put together an assessment on WMDs, and that, of course, has since been shown by the Congress to have been full of just really bad intelligence work, number one, and number two, subjected to politicization at the higher levels. So the idea was we need to convince. So here's the Pentagon, or at least the civilians at the Pentagon. Certainly, I don't think the military were thinking this up, even at the general, even at the flag officer level. But the civilians at the Pentagon are political appointees, guys like Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, Doug Feith, our boss Bill Lutey, who served underneath Doug Feith. These guys are saying, how do we drum up a positive rationale for war, a war that we've already planned and are basically ready to do, ready to go do this thing. But we can't do it unless, we need to help the president convince the people to do this. First off, that's just not something that I had ever seen in 19 years prior. I only worked in the Pentagon for 5 years, but I don't recall during the during the Clinton years, we did the Bosnia Kosovo thing. We did Operation Deny Flight, which I served for a part of my time in Aviano there under that mission. And I don't recall military folk pushing for this or that. The only thing I can recall is a certain Air Force general wanted to make sure that he had the authorities that he would need to go do things like that, operational issues, but not political issues. In fact, the military, if anything, was kind of keeping Clinton and his advisors, at length, saying, look, let's take this thing slow. Let's kind of make sure that we do this the right way with minimal risk to Americans, that we know what the objective is. And it wasn't in a perfect result in any case, but that's how I recall the military behaving. That's how I recall the Pentagon behaving. Not the way I saw them in 2002 with Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and Feith and these guys basically going out, drumming up support for a war, not ever saying, hey, let's think about this, which is usually the role that the senior commanders in the Pentagon play. They didn't play that role. At least the civilians did not. They played the role of war cheerleader, basically... And of course, the intelligence budget, 70% of the intelligence budget, 70 or 80, falls under the Defense Department. And that was also being mobilized to try to build up a sense of public necessity to go in and do Saddam Hussein. Now, do what to him is not clear. I guess we wanted to topple him. Very little discussion was ever held prior to the invasion as to what we really envisioned, other than, I guess Wolfowitz thought that... they would throw candy and flowers. I think there would be parades welcoming the liberating American soldiers, some kind of retro, liberation of France or something. Of course, none of that was realistic. And I don't recall a large, widespread American discussion on what it was going to be like afterwards. They didn't care. The idea was to get Americans behind a war such that we could go do this thing. And my view, which I came to several months after I realized this war was going to happen, it was inevitable. All we were waiting on were the American people to get behind it, which the president and vice president did. They succeeded in that with the help of the Pentagon senior leadership. But once I knew it was going to happen, the idea of what would happen afterwards, and the very glaring absence of an exit strategy at that time, told me that there was no exit strategy. We're not talking about an exit strategy because we're not leaving Iraq, which is pretty much clear now. As one of the first things that we've done as soon as we invaded and seized the halls of power, basically, was begin work on bases, base building. Halliburton, Kellogg Brown and Root, Bechtel, these are base construction contracts. And that's what they've done. And those bases are mostly done now, a year or so later. And we're not leaving those bases. If we have to, if the whole place falls apart around us, there'll be little Guantanamos in the middle of a hostile territory, but they'll still be American bases. And as I look back in 2002, as I saw this thing happening, and I wondered why the Powell Doctrine was being so viciously and blatantly ignored, especially given Powell was over there in the State Department. You'd think he might have some incentive to maybe push for sanity, and I think he did for a time. But the Powell Doctrine was ignored because had we applied the Powell Doctrine, there would have been no war in Iraq. First off, there was no clear objective and overwhelming reason. There was no exit strategy. They didn't want an exit strategy. And the idea of using overwhelming force was not something they could sell to the American people. They needed to be able to tell the American people, we can do this. The very small amount of force is a minimal effort, minimal cost to you, Mr. and Mrs. American citizen. So it was clear why they rejected, after the fact, it was very clear why they rejected the Powell Doctrine. During the time, I really thought that what a lot of people thought, and that the neoconservatives rejected the Powell Doctrine because they'd never heard of it. They really don't have military experience. These guys are not... most of the people making the policy have very little sensitivity and understanding of what the military is, how it works. Their views on world power and balance of power and how to change the world are really immature, very immature views, like boys that play with toys. You play war games. You're not limited by reality. There's an element of fantasy involved when you play cowboys and Indians. That's what these guys are. That's where they are in their strategic thinking as far as war. Now, at a larger level, the idea that the neoconservatives had of permanently reshaping and changing the Middle East through permanent placement of very, very strategically located bases in Iraq. There's something of good strategy there. If you are okay with lying to get there, which is what they did, and what they had to do was to lie to get there. I mean, because they could have told the American people, look, The biggest oil fields, certainly the second biggest, but possibly the largest oil fields in the world that we know of are in Iraq. Saddam Hussein is not our friend. We are dependent on oil. China wants this oil 15 years from now. They'd like it now. The only way that we will be able to stay on top, which is what the neoconservatives care about, staying on top, is to occupy Iraq and place our military bases there and basically leverage the rest of the Middle East through this process. Now, that is something that we could debate. Sane and normal people can discuss this. Is this in our interest? Is it something we can do? And it could have been sold to the American people. Most likely, American people would have said, is there a non-war way of getting to the same conclusion? And of course, there are many non-war ways to have gotten to the same place. The neoconservatives did not want that debate. Therefore, they created, they created the artificial reasons, which we now know. In 2004, we now know that these reasons were almost entirely false, which is just an awful thing to think that your government would lie to you in order to take over another country. It's not unprecedented, certainly in their history, that's happened. But you'd think in the age of the internet, in modern media, connectivity, global connectivity that we have, you'd think that that the American people could not have had the wool pulled over their eyes so easily, or the Congress itself have the wool pulled over its eyes, and yet it's exactly what happened. So,
and do you fault the media to some extent for not asking why we were doing?
The American media is at fault. If you think about the media in an interconnected world, and you include the international media, it really makes the American media look a lot worse, because the international media, who are often predisposed to be critical of United States policy. Granted, American media shouldn't be predisposed to be critical of our policy, but the overseas media, in their predisposition to question what it was America was doing, and in their use of a far wider range of sources, international sources, understood very well and very quickly what was going on in this country. They understood, the international media. And many, if you look back now, you'll find that the same questions that the American media 2 years later are beginning to ask, and are beginning to say, we really should have asked that question. These questions were being asked in the international media. And folks who are news nuts, or people that stay on the internet and read a lot of news and get their sources from more than just domestic media on international subjects, they knew. In fact, that's the core of your criticism that came from academia, that came maybe from some of the left-wing side of the house. These guys were getting information, very valid information, from sources that the American media was pretty much not even including. And I don't know if it's reporters or if it's editors, because the editors are the ones who say, I don't want another story like this. I want a story like this. The editor is the one that says, look, if you lose your access to your Pentagon sources, if you lose your access for my media corporation to the White House because of this story or that story, you cost me money. Therefore, I'm advising you as your boss, don't lose my access. And it was very clear that this administration has been effective in holding access to reporters hostage to the kinds of stories that they produce. And if you notice, there's a few old, I shouldn't say old, but there's a few independent American broadcasters. And the one I'm thinking of is who's the lady, the White House correspondent? Helen Thomas is a prime. Helen Thomas is a prime example. Okay, but there's some American reporters who stood up to this kind of thing, and I think a good example of this is Helen Thomas, who reported on many White Houses, and she is one of the few who sets the standard for asking hard questions. I don't know if it's because she is very experienced. I don't know if it's because of her particular views, but whatever it is, she sets an example, and it's an example that many of the baby boomer age reporters, Helen Thomas is far beyond baby boomer age. The folks in the generation after her, the baby boomer generation, 45 to 65, these reporters conformed just as that generation has always done. That generation, I'm sorry to say, and I'm the tail end of the baby boom myself, but that generation has conformed consistently and has indulged itself and has never really achieved. I think we talked about we haven't talked about it, but the idea of a greatest generation, that's a false concept. But the idea that the World War II generation was somehow a very unique and special generation, people that could self-sacrifice, people that could contribute of themselves for the betterment of the country, against odds, against harsh economic conditions, whatever. This is a false idea that there's some such thing as a greatest generation. However, the baby boomers would never receive that label, okay, because they don't sacrifice, they don't take risks that are anything beyond comfort zone risks. And so I think they are the ones that failed. And if you look at the reporters in this country who have, American reporters who have pushed the envelope, who have asked the hard questions, it's been the ones younger. This is the X and Y generation reporters. These guys are not conforming. These guys are asking hard questions. Unfortunately, their bosses are the guys in the baby boom generation. So they have some restraints placed on them. But to an extent, this whole problem of being sold a package of lies in order to go conduct a war for reasons that exist but are still not openly shared. Occupation, permanent occupation of Iraq is an objective. We haven't talked about that. We haven't really admitted that we intend to be there for 20 years. People, senior military officers have said this, but it hasn't really become part of mainstream thought. But this is a problem that all Americans share in to a certain extent. It's not just the media that didn't ask the questions. It's not just the Congress that didn't do their job. It's not just George Bush and Dick Cheney, baby boomers themselves, who are pushing lies, who feel that it's okay to lie to get your way. It's all the rest of Americans who say, I don't really want to rock the boat. And not rocking the boat is, to me, a very clear characteristic of the baby boomer generation. And, we think of them, but they're the ones that marched at the college campuses. But most of the people who marched to anti-Vietnam demonstrators went there, like we do a lot of things, for the free booze and for the fun and for the, won't this be something different, something entertaining. I don't give them huge credit for being independent thinkers. I give them huge credit for following the pack, and that's exactly what we've all done in this country, and that's why we have the situation in Iraq, which we have to live with. We've gone into a country, destroyed its infrastructure, destroyed its form of government. Not that it was a very good form of government, but it was something that worked, and replaced it with something that is not only very, very corrupt, financially corrupt. The folks that we've put in place in Iraq are awful. Crooked people, no better than any of the folks that they had under Saddam Hussein. But also, it doesn't work. See, there's some things that are corrupt that actually work. The mafia tends to work. It's sustained itself for a long time. You can say, well, they're crooked, but they work. What we have put in Iraq does not work. It's not only crooked, but it does not work. So we have to live with that. All the dead folks on the Iraqi side, all the dead Americans, maimed Americans, people that are injured psychologically as a result of being put in that situation unnecessarily. All of us in America will live with that. It's not just the media's fault, not just the Congress's fault. It's all of our fault in a sense for not standing up and demanding answers and demanding that the rule of law be followed. We have a constitution in this country, and the Constitution says that that the Congress declares war, not the president. And the Constitution doesn't really prohibit the Congress from doing what they did, which was to say, whatever you want to do, Mr. President, is fine with us. But it by its very nature, discourages that kind of granting of executive authority. And our Congress, of course, ignored that. But the people also ignored that. The people were only too happy in this country to say, oh yeah, Saddam Hussein is a really bad guy, and we should go do something about him. We should finish what we started back in 1991. So all these things, lazy thinking, lazy Americans, and we all are going to pay for that.
And when you look at the kind of the state of the news media, what you have is reporting events, following the public relations campaign of the Bush administration. Every day they were out there giving little incremental news. They're pushing the story forward. And that's what the beat reporters were focusing on. Now, as an intelligence analyst.
Well, I'm not an intelligence analyst, but a policy analyst.
But policy analyst, when you're looking at, events and issues, complex issues over time. Now, when you look at this time period and you look at shifts that are being made, the Bush administration's attitude towards the UN, or can you kind of elaborate what kind of patterns that you saw within Bush administration's PR campaign?
Well, certainly fear-mongering is the biggest characteristic. You know, the continual hammering of information that we at the time inside the Pentagon knew to be false information about Saddam Hussein's ability to send UAVs with chemical weapons, Saddam Hussein's capabilities. This was something that the military and the intelligence community had looked at for a long time. And so the focus that Saddam was dangerous because of these things didn't ring true to most people watching it. The fact that they continued to hammer this tells me that the objective was not about the truth or even educating people, but the objective was to inspire fear. Certainly the linkages back to 9/11, certainly we knew. The Congress has said, oh yeah, there was no relation between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. Well, we knew that. The people who watched the intelligence already knew that. The neocons, of course, didn't believe it, but the rest of us, the body of the intelligence work, knew that there was no relationship. And so the fact that Bush and Cheney would continue to make those public statements tells you that what they were doing was pure propaganda. It was really to inspire fear, to kind of tag on to that anxiety that had been generated from 9/11 in order to gain support for their war. So that was one thing. Now, Bush has always had contempt for the United Nations, and so, in a sense, does one of the Republican platforms. In a sense, is this idea that our sovereignty is sacrosanct, which it is, and I certainly agree with that. I'm a conservative myself. So Bush made points in treating the UN badly with some of his conservative base, who doesn't like the UN for other reasons. But in, I think it was November, Secretary of State Powell was able to convince George Bush that if he wanted to have a real coalition, not just this fake coalition or coalition of the willing, the odd 20 soldiers here and 20 soldiers here with 150,000 of Americans, that's not quite a coalition. If he wanted anybody beyond Great Britain, that he would need to try to get some support from the United Nations. And he convinced him to go back there. Now, Bush, I think, as a person, I don't know him, of course, I don't believe that he really cares what the UN thinks in his heart of hearts. But it is interesting that now that he's defending his position long after the fact, now that the truth is coming out about the lies that were told, that one of the things he says is that, look, the UN wanted us to do this, which, of course, is again, rewriting history to make it fit your own needs. But the patterns were very much, not the patterns that you saw with the Bush administration. It may be normal for governments to do this, but I would see it much more consistent with an advertising campaign, with a product, with marketing. They were basically marketing a product. And that product was, we need to go in and do this war in Iraq. We need to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They didn't say occupy the country, but that they didn't need to, because once we were there with our troops, we would occupy the country. We would build our bases. That was the unsaid part of the deal. But really what they were doing was marketing a product. And I think that's very different, I think, than making statesman-like decisions or conducting the government foreign policy in such a way that it preserves American interests. That's not what they were doing. They were marketing a product. They had this product on the shelf. That was we're going to take over Iraq. We are able to do it, but we need to find out what the customer base looks like. Will they buy this new Coke? Well, they did buy it for a while. And then after they tasted it, the American people and the media and everybody else has said, oh man, this really sucks. Not good. So, but it was a marketing campaign, not a governance, not anything that is a mark of governance. That's how it looks to me.
And if you were, put your shoes in a journalist, outside of the information that you were hearing, but with your kind of background of like looking at these type of patterns, what would you have done just with the declassified information that was out there?
It's a hard question. The pressure on American journalists from their media corporations and from their bosses who didn't want to lose access was a lot.